Welcome, friends, to Generations. Kevin Swanson here. Has our president come unhinged? That question might have occurred to a few folks, even on the conservative and Christian side of things. The president, Donald Trump, took a few swipes at conservatives Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, Megyn Kelly et al., calling them fools, low IQs, the typical stuff. He took a pretty firm swipe out at the Pope last week. He informed NATO nations also, quote, "The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us." He threatened Iranians that, quote, "a whole civilization will die tonight." That was just last week. And then the president uploaded an AI-generated image presenting himself in the likeness of Jesus. The president then made a public use of the F word in an Easter message to Iran, consigning the Iranians to hell. Commentator Tucker Carlson chastised the president for that, calling the language scandalous. That he would air these words on the day the Prince of Peace rose from the dead, Tucker said, was vile on every level. Tucker went on, desecrating Easter was the first step towards nuclear war. Well, the president responded with this salvo: Tucker's low IQ person that has absolutely no idea what's going on. This is likely the most public and intentional use of the F word by a sitting U.S. president, possibly the most overt use in modern history. Since the days of George Washington, the U.S. presidents have used a formal tone and controlled language as is appropriate for the dignity of the office. They would avoid explicit vulgarity in official or public-facing remarks. Sometimes behind the scenes, you've got Lyndon B. Johnson and Truman and Nixon doing their thing, but not in public. So what is this? Are these merely arguments between preteens in a junior high locker room? I don't think so, actually. Shall we give the president a free pass on this? Some conservatives and Christians won't give him a free pass on this stuff, but there is the argument that the president is bold, disruptive, and results-driven. He upsets the apple cart, and the apple cart really needs to be turned over anyway. He's the bull in the china shop, and he breaks all the china. And some of the china we appreciate. He's busted up. But then again, is this a president who's judicious, sagacious, and acting in the fear of God? Or, put another way, is the president presidential? Our previous president was borderline senile. This president is borderline something else. We're not sure what it is. What does that say about America? We are a nation on the edge, my friends. Senility, insanity, polarization, and maybe a little unhinged as a nation. Diplomacy has pretty much gone out the window. Donald Trump has got some similarities to Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte. Remember Duterte? Also, we elected a president who had 91 felony counts under multiple indictments against him. His enemies wanted him in prison. Everybody knew he was going to take the gloves off. I mean, come on. He was going to make his last 4 years count. Everybody knew Trump had an ego issue. Everybody should know that pride comes before a fall. We weren't sure that Trump was pro-life, but we did know that Trump was pro-Trump. We've always said that. So as you consider the president, one thing I want you to consider, understand the pro-wrestling mentality. Egos are involved, yes. The matches are sort of faked, but sort of not. They sort of play for keeps in pro wrestling, but they sort of don't until they do. Pro wrestlers taunt their competitors, and they sort of mean it, but then they sort of don't. But politics is real, and I mean real. This is the real world. The entertainment world is separated from the real world, but the Trump household is not really a reality program, but it kind of is a reality program, not too far off from the Kardashians. But politics is real, irreversible consequences. Unlike pro wrestling storylines, policies in politics actually do affect economies, international relations, and human lives. Not all actors are in on the script, so to speak. In wrestling, participants generally share an understanding of the performance and all that, but in politics, opponents may take statements literally. Allies may be unsure how seriously to interpret the rhetoric, and foreign leaders may react defensively or aggressively, but foremost to consider for the society that's wandering around the wasteland of postmodern non-reality relativism is this. Here it is. Ready for this? God is real. That's right. The fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. And without the fear of God, everybody comes unhinged. Ultimately, unhinging is what? It's to lack sobriety, to lack the fear of God, to fail to recognize the stakes at risk in the decisions made and actions taken. We are dealing with a society that is almost thoroughly without true sobriety, distracted and unhinged from reality for now. The fear of God is hardly mentioned in churches and Christian schools, although the fear of God is the very beginning of wisdom and knowledge. The consequences of such a worldview will be disastrous, especially for the nations of the world. You know, at one time, more sober minds, cooler minds prevailed with Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush. Remember those guys? It was a different world, previous generations. But this is not the age of cool minds, wise hearts, restrained language, and bridled tongues. Threaten every country in the world with tariffs, keep knocking the Muslim world around, which, by the way, makes up the other 1.8 billion people in the world. Use incendiary language every chance you can get. Basically ignore every lesson in the book of Proverbs, God's book of wisdom, and see what happens. Suffice it to say that we are one worldview, recession, depression away from a world war. We're teetering right now on the edge. We are on the edge. In the providence of God, we are moving inexorably in the direction of a worldwide upset of biblical proportions. Well, now, I believe that Christians can be salt and light in this milieu. That's why I wrote the book Under God, A Battle Plan for Reforming Civil Government, now available at generations.org. It's a 500-page manifesto, survey, preparation manual for raising the next generation of principled leaders, and I think it will count for the next generation big time, big time. Geopolitics today on Generations with Bill Jack. And what's with Israel? So, Bill, this is big. Now, the U.S. hasn't been involved with Israel. The U.S. has been involved in Middle Eastern wars since, the early 1990s, but let's back it up even further back. Yeah. This has been the cauldron of wars for the last 50 years, 60 years, 80 years, 90 years of world history, with the exception of Vietnam and a few others. But now Israel is nervous right now because America's attitude towards the nation of Israel is shifting, and there's no question. This is going to make a geopolitical difference, I believe, for our nation, for Israel, and for the entire world if this continues to go this direction. Now,
let me look. I'm looking around here. Where's my can of gas? I'm looking for my can of gasoline because I'm about to pour a can of gasoline on the fire of this discussion.
And then light it up. Because, no, here's the deal. We're just working on a survey here. Now, I want to explain what's going on, what I believe to be going on in the mind of Americans, because what we're seeing is a lack of support for the nation of Israel. A percentage of Americans viewing Israel unfavorably has increased from 42% in 2022. Now, that's only 4 years ago. 42% of Americans were unfavorable towards the nation of Israel in 2022. And this could be the war, right? Or the recent wars that seem to be souring the attitude of Americans towards Israel. Now, apparently, according to this Pew Research survey, and I don't see Pew Research to be much biased on this issue. They're just asking the question. And what they're discovering is that Americans viewing Israel unfavorably has increased from 42% 3 years ago to 60% most recently. That's a pretty good step in just 2 years or 3 years. That represents a 6% uptick from last year's survey. So just since last year, you've got a 6% uptick on this. So it was up 54%, 60%. Now, 41% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats view the nation of Israel unfavorably. So it means the still majority of Republicans, and we talked about this off air, that the Republicans are still somewhat in support of Israel. We're talking about 59%. But Democrats, 80%, 70% of U.S. adults under 50 years of age have an unfavorable view of Israel. So the younger generation is losing its, enthusiasm for supporting the nation of Israel. Now, I want to dissect this on the program, Bill. And you've run into this too. You ran into somebody who said, I stand with Israel. You've seen this before. In fact, I think it's been on caps, it's been on shirts.
Yeah.
It's been on bumpers.
This out at a meeting. I said, okay, we're going to talk about this. I was asked to talk about Israel and anti-Semitism. And so I started with, I stand with Israel.
Mm-hmm. So what's that mean?
That's the question.
That's
that
the
needs to be asked.
$100,000 question. Yeah.
Because when you say that, it is too vague a statement. Just recently, the Colorado State Assembly, the gathering of Republicans, and then we selected candidates, but we also passed resolutions, and one of the resolutions was a support of Israel, that we as the United States should support Israel. That's still vague.
What does that mean? Does that mean
what does that mean?
That we're going to support $40 billion of foreign aid to Israel next year, make that $200 billion, and if you don't support this particular resolution to write a check of $500 billion for Israel, you're anti-Semitic.
You can be labeled that way. So when you answer the question, when you make the statement, I stand with Israel, you're correct. The question has to be, well, what do you mean by Israel? Mm-hmm. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are three definitions you could use for Israel. They could be the ethnic Jews, those who claim ethnicity as Jewish. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the sub-question on that. How do you determine that?
It's hard to know for sure.
Because you can't trace your lineage back through Levi, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You can't go back to Abraham.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The records aren't there. So, and there are Jews who are Jews ethnically by conversion. They choose to convert to Judaism.
Right. So religiously they're Jews.
Religiously they're Jewish. Then there is the spiritual Jew. I'm looking at one. You're looking at one.
Right.
We've been
spiritual
grafted
children of Israel. They've been grafted into the olive tree.
We're the spiritual children of Abraham. Right. Now, the Old Testament is not a Jewish document. It is a Christian document because it's the foreshadowing of everything that was fulfilled in Christ. And Abraham was declared righteous not because he was Jewish, but he was declared righteous by faith. Mm-hmm. So there's ethnic Judaism. There are those who have decided that they want to become Jewish. Okay, mm-hmm. There are spiritual Jews, and then there's the nation of Israel.
So you're up to 4 now.
I'm actually up to 4. Mm-hmm. Right. So when you say I stand with Israel, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And then you can talk about how your theology or your view of end times, your eschatology, if you will, kind of informs how you interpret the scriptures surrounding your answer to I stand with Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, basically, there's the dispensational view that that God's not finished with Israel, and they interpret certain passages of Scripture in support of Israel as a nation, and God still working through and His promises continuing. And then there's the fulfillment view, which says that no, that Christians, it was a foreshadowing of the church mm-hmm. and those who are now spiritual Jews by grafting in. Mm-hmm. And so, and these two views will kind of will color and inform your view of the statement, I stand with Israel. How you define that and your view on eschatology will color and inform what you mean by I stand with Israel. So we've got to be very cautious when we just make a blanket statement. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. Refute that in 3 words. You can't. Mm-mm. I stand with Israel. Well, refute that in 4 words. You can't do that. It requires an unpacking mm-hmm. of a lot of different things, basically defining terms so that you and I are talking and communicating clearly, not talking at cross purposes or at different levels. Mm-hmm. So we have to be cautious as Christians that we, first of all, define our terms carefully, that we understand that people bring to the table on the discussion of Israel their nuances on theology, mm-hmm. their nuances on eschatology, and so it's not merely a bumper sticker slogan that can define your position on this topic. Now, I think that what you've quoted is the result that the drop in support for Israel is a result of the educational system and the invasion of Islamic belief system into the culture. I think, and I've said this many times, 9/11 was probably the greatest PR move for Islam in this nation.
Why is that, Bill?
Because after 9/11, and you remember George Bush did this, we bent over backwards to make certain that we were not condemning of the religion when we said, yeah, those terrorists, but not all Muslims are terrorists. Not all Muslims believe that. So we bent over backwards and we welcomed in the religion of Islam while at the same time condemning the act of terrorism. But we didn't tie the terrorism to the religious system. We tried very carefully to separate those two. And we didn't want to have the appearance of being anti-Islamic.
I have another
Islamophobic.
I have another theory, and I'll throw this in. I think the liberals jumped on this because the enemy of our enemy is our friend. And the liberals so hate the Christian worldview that once the Muslim worldview entered into the picture in the U.S. and the Western world, the liberals, first of all, they're apostates. They hate Jesus. They absolutely hate all Christianity, anything that even has a Christian flavor to it. And when they discover that the Muslims are opposed to Christianity as well, and perhaps one of the most ardent persecutors of the Christian faith, slaughtering 95 to 98% of the religious martyrs in the world in any given year, the liberals effectively say yay to that. Effectively. I mean, maybe they're not as in support of the martyrdoms, but they certainly are in support of the antagonism to the Christian faith that is such a commitment in the heart of the average Muslim that the liberals will embrace that. And I think it has much to do with the fact that liberals really are looking for an enemy of their enemy, and that is the Muslim faith. For that reason, they have glorified the Islam religion as much as they possibly can over the last 25 years, certainly during the reign of Barack Obama, for example.
Exactly. And isn't it odd that those who tout that women are no different than men, that women, in fact, in many ways are superior to men, they've touted this radical feminism, then turn to Islam, which is hostile to women.
Entirely hostile to it,
And yet, it's because of that, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
It's a huge thing.
That I will side with anyone who is anti-Christian.
Huge.
And so those two things, I believe, have worked to the point where those who are under the age of 35 now have a distorted view of geopolitics.
Yeah.
Now, my generation, I remember the 1968 Six-Day War. Was it 1968, Six-Day War? 72, maybe? But
I was 4 years old at the time, Bill.
Shut up, in a godly way.
Keep going?
Yeah. Okay. But because I remember that, I mean, there wasn't any American who was anti-Israel at the time. I doubt that you could find 10% of the populace who were hostile to supporting Israel. Everybody was cheering Israel on. But
that's
then
changing. Then
you had October 7, and we saw that it was an attack on Israel, and yet we now have turned that. In our day, we have turned that into Israel being the aggressor, not the victim.
Now let's go over a few other things. I have added explanations for why the drop-off of 60% supported Israel in 2022, now off down to 40% of the U.S. population supporting Israel. And it has, I think, something to do with the shrinkage of white evangelicalism in America. Yep. And here's why. Back in year 2000, 23% of Americans confessed to be evangelical. Now that's down to 14%, so that's a 10% drop-off, roughly. So it's huge. This is one of the biggest religious demographic shifts in American history. So, and we have seen this. We've seen this in American churches. Yeah, a few mega churches are picking up all the, remnants here and there, but they're also going to fade away in the next few years anyway. But yeah, the big drop off of the apostasy, the walking away from the evangelical churches amongst the younger generation has been really, really significant. And keep in mind now, since about 60% of evangelicals are dispensational pre-mill, about 60%. That means that dispensationalists only make up about 10% of the overall U.S. population, and that's down from roughly 20% 25 years ago. So that's a big shift. That's an ideological shift in the mind of the average American. Okay, so you have only 10%. Now, 10% is pretty far off of a significant minority. 20% was something, right. But you're talking about half of those who are committed to the dispensational philosophy,
which historically has been in support of Israel as a nation.
Yeah, okay? Absolutely.
That we should support Israel.
Right. And that's been a big part of it. But also keep in mind that dispensationalism itself is not nearly as hardcore as it was in the Schofield years. And there's been a ton of backpedaling going on, even within dispensationalism itself.
Right.
Moreover, I think what's happening is an apocalyptic burnout. After various cults and Christian sects have been waiting on hillsides for Jesus' return since 1830. That's almost 200 years, if you think about it, And, there's been a ton of these cults and Christian sects that developed, and they were prognosticating that Jesus was going to come back and set up his reign in Jerusalem or St. Louis or somewhere. And it didn't happen in 1988. It didn't happen in 1992. It didn't happen in 2004. It didn't happen in 2023. I think, the years are going along, and I think we're running out of this millennial fervor or this apocalyptic vision, this idea that you can set a date and Jesus is coming back within the next 10 years, 20 years, 24 years, 32 years, whatever the word imminent means, whatever it meant in 1933, whatever it meant in 1845, whatever it meant in 1933, whatever it meant in 1948, whatever it meant in 1988, the imminent return of Jesus isn't quite, something people are betting on like they did in 1840 or like they did with the Adventist groups in the latter part of the 19th century or like they did in 1987. Remember, 1988 was the full generation, 40 years following the 1948 establishment of Israel as the nation.
Now,
so I think we're dealing with some of that within the church.
But that doesn't account for what I'm saying and what you and I have talked about before, and that is the anti-Semitism. That's different.
It is.
That's different.
But I think we're not putting the two together. There certainly is something of a cooling.
Yes, but the anti-Semitism, I think, is a direct result of the culture, especially academia and the media, embracing Islam, which is hostile to
especially universities.
To the nation of Israel existing.
All right, and let me piggyback on that as well, because I think there has been a national conscience about genocide that was strong in the American mind following World War II and the uncovering of the Nazi genocide.
Right.
And something that you have testified to, your father testified to it, many others came back from Nazi Germany, and the horror of it. There was a horror that something that was about as grotesque as anything any tyranny had ever accomplished in the history of mankind. The Nazis were tyrannical. They were absolutely tyrannical.
Muslim leaders were part of the Axis. They were supporters of Hitler.
Good point.
Yeah.
But I think people didn't understand that there was a horror of it. People consider genocide like a horror film.
Right.
Piles of bodies and the whole thing. Genocides were big in the 20th century, no question. And yet, I think what has happened is the national conscience is disappearing on this issue. We are distanced from the World War II Holocaust by, some distance. What is it, 85 years? Something like that. It's been a time. And 63% of millennials and Gen Zers are not aware of the Holocaust, at least in terms of its numbers. And that's a recent survey.
And their conscience has been seared by the equal number of unborn children who've been sacrificed in the ensuing years from the Holocaust.
Right. We've been killing 80 million babies since 1973, and that's certainly played into it. Also, let me throw this out as well. Relativism, I think, is impacting the youth. 60% of Americans are relativists. 75% of younger millennials are relativists. And what does that mean?
And that plays into this whole thing that it's the myth of moral relativism. Mm-hmm. Well, we can't say that we as a nation are better than, say, Nazi Germany because we had slavery. Mm-hmm. It's a moral equivalency that does not exist. Mm-hmm. I had this discussion with a student at Worldview who had come out of Islam. He had trusted Christ, but he had never renounced Islam. And he was advocating that Israel was the aggressor. I mean, he had arguments, and the more we talked, the more I realized that a pastor that is Pakistani, he works in the Middle East. He said when they get a convert to Islam, they make him publicly stand up and renounce Islam. And I just suggested to this student, I said, perhaps you would want to do that. And this was earlier in the week. On Friday, we closed, and he came up to me after closing, and we had some music, and we had a closing, and he said, I haven't wept in 4 or 5 years. He said, but during the music, during the worship set, he said, I wept. He said, because last night, with my small group, I did what you said. I publicly renounced Islam. There was a whole difference in his countenance.
Oh, I see, right. Mm-hmm.
And this pastor had said, if we don't have converts from Islam do that, he said there is a residual effect because Islam is so demonic that it is not just a false religion, it is a demonic religion, and that has an impact on this whole discussion. Mm-hmm. And we have embraced this to the point where now we have, if you speak out against Islam, you're Islamophobic. Mm-hmm. Well, the converse is if you speak out against Israel, then it's okay because now we've become, against Israel.
Now let's get back to the statement, I stand with Israel. What does that mean? Now, you've got guys like Tucker Carlson, Rand Paul, and others that are getting tired of involvement of American soldiers and the American war machine.
The argument is that Trump promised never to get involved, get involved, and suddenly we are involved.
Yeah. And
we're embroiled in a conflict.
About as embroiled as anybody's been for a long time in the Middle East.
So they're going after Trump on this.
Yeah, they are. And let me say this, that to be pacifist, and I'm not in favor of pacifism, by the way.
No.
But to be a pacifist does not equate to being anti-Semitic.
Correct.
So let's be careful. One of the points we want to make is, be careful, be distinguishing in your mind between these different perspectives and positions that people take. And I think allow for a degree of Christian liberty and differences in opinions on these sorts of things. Now, I happen to be a little bit more isolationistic. I tend not to be in big favor of spending $300 billion in foreign aid. I'm just not on that bandwagon. And yet I'm not anti-Semitic, but I'm not a big fan of sending our soldiers out to do anything but defend our borders. And the idea that Iranian nukes or Iranian missiles could reach American shores, they weren't even close. They could barely get a missile into Bulgaria. In fact, I've been watching the missiles. They've managed to lob them into their neighboring countries, which is kind of sad. They don't do that kind of stuff. But they've got into Turkey. They've got, a few. I think Cyprus got hit. They can't get a ballistic missile beyond Cyprus. That's where they are right now. Now, that's my perspective on politics is that God has assigned Donald Trump and the government of the United States to defend the nation of the United States of America. That's their responsibility.
All right.
Now, I do believe that Israel can raise money from private people. If you as a private person want to contribute, I'm not against that. And I think the United States government could probably allow for something like that. But, if you're putting a gun to my head and said, you've got to support Israel with $80 billion of foreign aid, or you're anti-Semitic, I just think that's unfair. That's unfair to say.
Yeah, it's a false dichotomy. Mm-hmm. Do I, when I say I stand with Israel, have to mean then that whatever Israel does, I have to agree with and endorse? And the answer would be anybody who would make that statement, I stand with Israel, would automatically say no.
Shouldn't mean that.
But I don't do that with my own country.
Right, sure.
Okay, I criticize the policies.
It's not America right or wrong.
Exactly.
It's not Israel right or wrong.
So that statement, I stand with Israel, there are qualifications.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, again, a Christian will answer that differently than an atheist who makes that same statement. I stand with Israel, and so we have to be very cautious. Did Israel on October 7? This was my discussion with that student again. I said, did Israel have a right to defend itself as a nation? Yes.
Well, of course, they can defend their borders.
And then he wanted to argue that they didn't have a right to exist going back to 1948. I said, wait, borders change all the time.
They do.
They change all the time.
They sure do. Just like it or not, they do.
Like it or not, we're dealing with what is happening right now. You cannot go back to 1948 and undo that. Does the nation of Israel have a right to defend itself? And the answer is yes, it does. Now, does that mean that there are not atrocities committed by Israeli soldiers? The answer is
probably. I'm sorry, we live in a
atrocities
sinful
committed
world.
in every war by every nation.
I mean, you want to talk about atrocities?
Yes,
you
but
want to
that
talk about
does not
Sherman and
mean,
Sheridan on the race down into Georgia.
But that does not mean that we're all morally equivalent. That there's not a nation that is right and a nation that is wrong.
Some nations that are better than others.
Yes, we cannot
some
defend.
Some nations better than others. Yeah,
we cannot say that because we had slavery, we're on the same plane of moral equivalence as Nazi Germany was. That's an absurd argument.
But as we slaughter 80 million babies, I begin to wonder if we are approaching Nazi Germany. You follow me there?
Yeah.
But
we're doing this. We're doing this when there's 3 pointing back at us.
Right. And my point is that we have to use the law of God as the standard by which to determine right and wrong, and whether some sins are more egregious in the sight of God than others has to be the standard of God's law, whereby we make that known. Well, friends, we're really trying to draw some important distinctions here, and we have to be careful with our language. That's really, I think, the big takeaway on this edition of the program. And let me recommend to you Under God, my new book, Under God, just released, my friends, available at generations.org. Under God, a battle plan for reforming civil government, now available at generations.org. It's a 500-page manifesto, survey of the entire world, of history, of great governments, the good, the bad, the ugly, a preparation manual for raising the next generation of principal leaders. I mean, that's my goal, that if Jesus tarries, and we have another opportunity at this post-World War III, or maybe it's pre-World War III. I don't care. We still need to raise up principled leaders who can act as men and women who fear God and hate covetousness and embrace the truth and qualify by the Exodus 18 and 2 Samuel 23 requirements for the civil magistrate. We can raise these up, and I hope we can educate them, prepare them, and they will be raised up to be salt and light in the next generation, Bill.
You know, what is the passage in the Old Testament? Was it Jacob who encountered the angel of the Lord, and he said, "Are you on?"
It was Joshua. Right before
Joshua. Yeah. Are you on our side or their side? What was the answer?
No.
I am on.
Jesus is on his own side.
Jesus is on his own side.
Yeah. The bigger question is, whose side are you on?
That's the question. We need leaders who stand before God Almighty and say, I'm not asking if you're on my side. Yeah. I'm asking, am I on your side?
And have I kissed the Son?
Yes.
Lest he be angry and you perish in the way. That's the bigger question for every leader out there. Thank you for capitalizing on that. And the new book, available at generations.org, is Under God, a battle plan for reforming civil government. And to get a copy, it's actually for every family that has children and wants to give a biblical civics approach for those kids. The book is also available for anybody who wants to get caught up on a biblical view of civics today and for tomorrow. Available at generations.org. This is Kevin Swanson and Bill Jack inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation. This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.